Welcome back. This is going to move to our final panel on economic and trade relations between US-China. And this panel is going to be chaired by Mr. Sourabh Gupta. And he's the senior fellow with Institute for China and American Studies.
Thank you, Nang. We're going to shift gears and move away from the security and strategic studies area and move on to trade and economic issues. Obviously, there has been a lot happening on this front. President Trump came in with strong words, candidate Trump came in with strong words on US-China trade relationship. Then we went to Mar-a-Lago, and suddenly President Trump and President Xi hit it off well. There was a 100-day action plan. And then we had the first comprehensive economic dialogue just last week. And things may not have gone that well. So it's been a little bit up and down. And there's obviously a lot happening in the area of China-US economic relations. We're not just talking trade, we're talking currency, investment, and macroeconomic issues. And there's also a lot of movement happening right now in US domestic trade policy, and we might be seeing a recalibration of how the US engages the world in the area of international trade. Let's begin. We are running a little late, but I'm sure we're going to have a very, very interesting conversation. We have a very distinguished panel. First of all, we are going to go with Mr. Yukon Huang. He's going to talk about on these issues, and he's got a full PowerPoint slide on this. Yukon has just published a book, which you will may also find very interesting. Yukon is a senior fellow in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Next, after that, I'm going to have Claude Barfield, who's the resident scholar at American Enterprise Institute and a long-time trade specialist in Washington, D.C., to give his views. He's done a lot of interesting work at the intersection of trade and cyber policy of late, which is a very, very hot topic. Third, we are going to go with Bill Reinsch. Bill has been a fixture in Washington, D.C. for a long time and has tremendous experience in government and outside government. He served as Undersecretary for Export Administration in the U.S. Department of Commerce, then President for 15 years at the National Foreign Trade Council. And he has been concurrently a member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Bill has great experience in congressional executive relations. He's going to speak after that. And finally, we will conclude with Yawei, who is the director of the China program at the Carter Center and has done very interesting work in the area of China's political development and grassroots democracy. So without any further ado, let's start with Yukon.
Can somebody put up the slide? Okay. I'm getting really tired. You're probably very tired. And economics is a very heavy subject. And so only economists use charts, because if they use words, no one wants to listen. No one can understand them. I want to talk about the key economic and trade issues affecting China. Very complicated subject matter. A tremendous amount of dispute. I'm not going to be able to answer them. I can't explain everything. But what I want you to understand a little bit better is what is the nature of the question. And my point is actually very few people understand it. And because most of their understanding is wrong, the policy prescriptions are wrong. And I'm going to try to explain to you why the understanding is wrong and why is it everybody's policy recommendations tend to be misplaced. There are three major issues that create these kinds of tensions. Are US-China trade balances related? China has a $340 billion trade surplus with America. That accounts for 60% of America's trade deficit. Everyone thinks that US trade deficits and China's trade surpluses are related. And the reality is they're not related at all. And why is that? Because if you understand that, then you realize that all the policy discussions that you read about is totally wrong. Now, everyone in the United States thinks that American firms invest too much in China. That leads to job loss, loss of competitiveness. You walk around the streets of Beijing and you see lots of American signs. So you're saying all these American companies pouring money into China, they should be investing at home. And that's President Trump's message. What's the reality? The reality actually is that American companies invest practically nothing in China. And then the question is why? Why do they invest practically nothing in China? Does it make sense for them to invest nothing in China? And the answer is, it makes a lot of sense. But did you ever read about it? Never. Here's the subject which really is going to generate a lot of tension between U.S. and China. Technology transfer and tensions. The U.S. is the world's leader in technology, innovation, high value added. China wants to go up the industrial production ladder. And the answer is it going to get it from the United States? In what ways? Is this good for both sides or is it bad for both sides? So these are the three major issues that you read about. They create tremendous amount of tensions, and then these tensions reverberate on the political sphere. So you get the South China Sea, North Korea. Are you going to bargain these for progress on the political front? That's the source of what my book talks about. My book is basically saying, no one understands these issues. Let's explain why. Let's take a look at U.S. trade deficits. This is it. This is U.S. trade deficits. They started in 97, 98, 99. And you can see that U.S. trade deficits as a percentage of global production really becomes seriously large, improved and stayed here, but still very significant. So here's U.S. trade deficits, and the question is, did China cause this? Here is China's trade surpluses. And the first thing you realize is China generates practically no surpluses until about 2004 and 5. And here it is. America's already having huge deficits. And then China's surpluses really soar. But America's deficit gets smaller. So the first thing you realize is U.S. and China trade balances move in opposite directions. They're actually not related at all, but everyone thinks they are. And now what you have is a slightly different situation. China's surpluses are getting bigger because growth has slowed down, so they import less, so the surplus gets larger. America's trade deficit is getting worse because the American economy is doing well, so you consumers are buying a lot more. That's actually a good thing. But the real factor that's changing global trade balances is the EU. Fundamentally before, imbalance, but now generating huge surpluses, and that's Germany. So the U.S.-China trade balance issue is getting much more complicated because the EU's role now is becoming very, very large. And this is a huge problem. So if China and U.S. trade balances are not related, why do we think they are? And here's what Ambassador Trey said. This is Americans' share of imports of manufactured goods from Asia. It's 45%. So Asian countries, from Japan, China, everyone, they provide about 45% of America's imports of manufactured goods. And the first thing to notice is it hasn't changed. Not in 15, 20 years. Now, if you go back to 1990, China accounted for about 10% of that. 90% came from Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, bing, bong, bong. And therefore, the bad boys were Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, not China. Here is China today. China now counts for 50, 60% of that share. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan shrunk a lot. So China looks like the bad boy in this. But the first thing to realize is the overall role of Asia hasn't changed in 20, 25 years. The second thing to realize is China's shares increased, but not its value added. So as the Ambassador Trey said, the iPhone made in China, $800. How much of this goes to China? 25. How much of it goes to Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore? 250. The other 400 is pure profit for Apple. So Apple really makes a bundle, but China counts for very little. Nevertheless, it shows up as an $800 import. And this is why you have this total confusion. Is it really related or is it not related? What causes trade balances? So the papers talk about tariffs, dumping, prices, all sorts of unfair practices. They actually have nothing to do with trade balances. Trade balances are explained by the differences between what a country saves and what a country invests. That's an accounting identity. If you save more than you invest, you have a trade surplus. If you save less than you invest, you have a trade deficit. So here is the U.S. Trade deficits are these yellow bars. And here it is. Savings rates in the U.S. falling dramatically. The investment levels don't change. So the question is, why does America run a trade deficit? Well, why have they been running one for 40 years in a row? Because America is not saving very much. And who is not saving? It's the government. You have a huge government deficit. The U.S. has a trade deficit. You have a huge government deficit, stays on forever, you will always have a deficit. Has nothing to do with China. But here is China. It runs a huge trade surplus because savings rates have been soaring for 25, 30 years, and particularly over the last 15 years. And this exceeds investment by a lot, so China runs a savings deficit and then a trade surplus. Now, the critical question is, how come China's savings rates have soared in the last 15 years? And people write all sorts of articles. Chinese love to save, they say. But Chinese have been saving forever, so that's not their reason. And they talk about exchange rates and interest rates. Actually, none of these have any effect on why savings rates have increased in China. So some people talk about pensions and social security systems are weak, so China need to save a lot more. But they were always weak. The actual reason why China saves much more today than they did 15 years ago is because of migrant workers. And when I say that, people are shocked. What does that have to do with savings? There are 250 million migrant workers now in China along the major coasts. They account for 40–50% of the labor force. Why does this explain savings rates surging? Because they save twice as much as normal Chinese. And this accounts for the totality of the increase in savings rates in China and the totality of China's trade surplus. How do you get rid of the surplus? You ask migrant workers to consume more. How do you get them to consume more? Well, as you know, they don't have residency permits. They can't buy houses, they can't buy cars, they can't spend food on their money and their kids. If they consume like normal Chinese, China would be a trade deficit country. But do you ever read an article about this? Not at all. It's never mentioned. They don't understand it. Let's look at China. China invests multiples more in the EU than in the US. Because people actually think that all the investment coming out of China is going to America, but actually most of it is going to the EU. Why is that? This is China's exports, US exports to China. Why does it, the American firms, why do they not invest in China? Well, what determines what a firm does? You invest in China, largely determined by what you export to China. So let's look at America's exports to China and ask the question, what are they? And do they lead to foreign investment? So what's the first largest category of America's exports to China? Anyone? Agriculture. Oil seizing. Does that require foreign direct investment? No. Second largest category. Boeing aircraft. But Boeing does not produce in China, so there's no foreign investment. Airbus does, so Europeans invest. Third largest category. Third largest category of Americans' exports to China. Very large. I asked this question to trade representative. I asked this to the Department of Commerce. Not a single person knows it. Not a single person knows it, and it's so huge. And none of you will know it. But the issue is that this product is commonly available. You deal with it every single day. Okay? What is it? What is it? Recycled cardboard and scrap metal. What you put out in the streets every day. Third largest category of U.S. exports to China. Does it lead to foreign direct investment? Obviously not. You're not going to invest for that purpose. Fourth category gets a little bit more complicated. Semiconductors and components. The Apples, the Dells, the computers. And they put it to China. China puts it into an iPhone, puts it in a computer. There's a big manufacturing plant in China. Is that America's investment in China? No. It's all Foxconn. It's a Taiwan investment. Do American companies like Apple invest in China? Apple has no foreign investment in China, although it produces everything in China. What's the fifth largest category of U.S. exports to China? And I can tell you, none of you get it. And no U.S. government official gets it. So how can they formulate policy when they don't even get it? This shocks everyone. Cars. Why does this shock you? Buick, but Buick's made in China. It's not exported to China, so that doesn't count. So what American cars are made in America shipped to China. Those are Japanese, right? Not those. Jaguars, BMWs, Mercedes-Benz, SUVs, BMWs, European, made in the US, shipped to China. Who does the foreign investment? European companies. That's why European companies invest in China, but American companies do not. Because if you look at this, there is no incentive for American companies to invest in China. That's why US investment in China is negligible. It is 1.5% of America's foreign investment. Only 1.5% of America's foreign investment goes to China. The other 99% goes to other countries. But how many times when you read a paper do you get that impression? That's why it's totally wrong. EU exports, however, manufactured goods, chemicals, crude materials. You walk through a mall in Beijing, 90% of the products are European. No wonder Europeans invest in China. There's a structural economic reason for investment relationships, but most of the dialogue talks about politics, security, tensions. They miss the whole point. The economic structure is a major factor, but no one recognizes it. Technology transfer. Here is a graph that says, how rapidly does a country adopt and make use of high-level technology produced elsewhere? Okay, so something is invented or something in Europe, United States. How long does it take a country, a poor emerging market country, to begin to use it and borrow it? China is in a class by itself. We've never seen anything quite like it. Its ability to adopt technology from abroad and to make money from it. And it started around the 80s and just soared. And it's above anything we've seen for any other country. So how does China do it? It does it through foreign investment. Foreign companies come to China, they establish a plant, technology is transferred. It does it through trade. China imports high-level equipment. China buys the design. China also steals, right? That generates a lot of tension. Now, in my book, I talk about theft, because stealing is actually an underrated policy instrument. What you learn when you look at countries which steal, remarkably, on a consistent basis, not many countries steal. Why? Because it turns out that only rapidly growing, low-income countries steal. And there are not many rapidly growing, low-income countries that steal, because it's actually very difficult to steal something and make money from it. It takes a talent. And there's all sorts of reasons why some countries are successful and some are not. So who are the successful countries? This is a chart that graphs theft of technology from the US. And I follow Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. And this is their per capita GDP. And this is the years. And you can see that Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, these purple or red lines is when they stole. And then when they got to a certain income level, they stopped stealing. That income level, by the way, is around $30,000. Here is China. It's stealing a lot, okay? How long is it going to take for it to get to 30,000? Well, it's going to take a long time. So this is going to be a big issue. And then the question is, how do you deal with this? Because this is a source of great tension. And I can't answer that in 5 seconds, but it's in my book also. What is the biggest issue in terms of US-China technology relations? It's basically that China restricts foreign investment, and its restrictions are largely in services, and services which make America's economy. That's America's comparative advantage. So the key issue then in the end is US-China have to talk about the restrictive policies in China on services and what to do about it. Now, more complicated is the long-term relationship. China has benefited greatly from technology transfers from the US and Europe. That's why it grows at 10% a year for so darn long. It's been good for China a lot. Is this good for America? Asia's success in lowering the cost of manufactured goods has helped the US excel in high-value services. If you think about what's been happening in America over the last 20 years, you realize that Americans in general have benefited enormously from a sharp decline in the value of manufactured consumer goods, which has allowed American companies and people to channel their resources into high-value services. And this is where America has become highly innovative. It dominates the internet. It dominates the entertainment sections. It dominates health services, education services. And it's been able to do this because of the lower cost of manufactured products coming from China. Now, is this a symbiotic, positive relationship? The answer is yes and no. It's not that straightforward. But we don't actually understand this process very well. And how you deal with this, the positive and negatives, well, there's a bilateral investment treaty that needs to be discussed. And the issue is this, that treaty needs to understand this relationship. And most of the time they don't. And therefore, they often just don't focus on the right issues. That's my book. My book, by the way, has a chapter on the South China Sea. And it basically says, if you read everything written by the conflict, security, and political scientists, the theme of my book, of course, is it's all wrong. So how would an economist look at the South China Sea? And the answer is they look at it completely differently. They would see it as a game theory. And what does game theory tell us? The game theory tells us, of course, there is no solution. The two sides will just debate forever. But there actually is a solution. There is a solution that will persuade both sides to actually say, hey, I'm not gaining anything. I need to make compromise. Well, what I find interesting in the literature is you never see that solution. But that's how the economists would look at it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Claude? Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm in an odd position. I was anyway, but for the first talk, I have to try to find a path that makes my point while agreeing so much with the points of the first speaker. Before I get into I guess I would make the theme here sort of the making of a trade hawk or the evolution of a trade hawk. And I am someone, as Bill Reinsch will tell you, is known around Washington as sort of a fierce free trader. My normal first and last trade policy is unilateral disarmament. I would better not do anything, and usually it would be bad. And I also have not been, in any sense, a hawk about the People's Republic of China and Beijing. I thought that the way we handled Yawei, for instance, has been disgraceful. Yawei may or may not be a security threat, but the United States has introduced its own due process and going against. I was also one of the few people here who, or not here, but around Washington, who actually thought we gave the Chinese a raw deal when we refused to change the non-market economy status. This had nothing to do with whether China was a market economy or not a market economy. There are lots of definitions of that. We made a deal 15 years ago that said, we didn't say anything about what the definition would be, but in 2016, at the end of 2016, that non-market economy status would change. The reason we didn't do it had nothing to do with definitions of market or non-market economy. It had to do with the fact that the companies, the sectors, and the political powers who were committed to anti-dumping laws did not want to change those laws. Even though we had anti-dumping laws that pretty much could control any imports that we wanted. This gave them an extra margin. So I start with that presumption, and I agree certainly with everything that was said about the foolishness about bilateral deficits and what produces a deficit or a balance overall, an international balance, whether it's China or the United States or whoever. All of that I agree with. And yet I'm reluctantly coming to believe that the United States cannot just stand supine in terms of what the professor was talking about at the end, the technology areas. And I think my point here is that, and here I do disagree I disagree in general with the trade policies as they've been announced so far, even though they haven't really gone very far. But I certainly disagree with the priorities that we have taken in the U.S.-China Comprehensive Economic Dialogue. The idea that we would, yes, there's a problem of overcapacity in steel and a problem of overcapacity in aluminum, but the idea that this is in any way defense-related for the United States is nonsense. We can get steel and aluminum from any place we want, and certainly plenty of steel and aluminum around. We're in a wash with it. So my problem with the U.S.-China economic dialogue is In the past, it hasn't produced very much. I don't think it's going to produce very much now. And where I think the United States should have really been hitting much harder is the really series of laws and certainly regulations that have made it increasingly difficult for the United States firms and other foreign firms to operate in China in the information and communications technology and internet-related sectors. And so there, I am, as I say, reluctantly coming to see that the United States, or at least to argue that the United States actually should take some action. I'll come back to that in a minute. But when you just look at the scene in terms of China now, 8 of the 25 most popular internet sites around the world are closed in China. There's Google and YouTube. They've closed the New York Times. Other major, not just the United States, we happen to have a comparative advantage in a lot of this and competitive advantage. So it hits U.S. companies more often, but it's just across the board. And the series of laws that have been passed, and I'm not going to go all over the national security law and several intelligence laws, the recent cybersecurity law, which came into effect formally in June, are really making the scene for a U.S. company to invest or to operate there increasingly difficult. The cybersecurity law has a sweeping definition of sectors and what cybersecurity means to the Chinese. It goes well into what we would count as domestic sectors, domestic industries. There is the force that anything that is counted as a critical infrastructure, and that could be a wide sweep of sectors, has special relations about data. You cannot move data around without checking in with the authorities. There are going to be sweeping national security reviews. A lot of this you've heard, and there's the phrase that comes up again and again, that data on the internet should be secure and controllable. So this makes it very difficult, I think, for going forward for U.S. and other foreign firms, I think, to operate competitively in China. Apple has just set up, as you probably may have seen, those of you who follow this, a data storage facility in southern China. But Apple was forced, in order to do that, to have a Chinese partner, which was actually a company that is really controlled by the local province. That partner actually will be the interface between Apple and its customers, and Apple and the provincial and the central government. Apple there is the same rules that I said before. You have to have permission to move data out of the country. It is, when you look, it's not just companies like Apple or not these companies like Google. It's companies that actually who are in other sectors, in manufacturing sectors or other service sectors, who need to move data back and forth. Now, let me admit that around the world, countries are looking to see how they will react in terms of where data goes and whether you have to have it, what data you have to store locally, and one data you can move around. But I think in China, it is increasingly impossible, actually, to operate under the conditions that the Chinese are imposing. I just want to make 2 other, actually, points so we can get to questions and debate here. The first one has to do with, okay, what do you do? I am someone who has always been skeptical of, and certainly in terms of the 1980s with the Japanese, opposed reciprocity issues. I think it is very dangerous. I also think that the United States, the political structure in the United States, the way we operate, makes it even more dangerous, as everyone will come forward with some reason for reciprocity. But I think increasingly that with the Chinese, in terms of investment at any rate, we will have to move towards some kind of set of rules. Whether we do it through, I'll come back to CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Direct Investment, in a minute. You could do it just arbitrarily by naming China. And I'm talking here about investment. I'm not talking about trade rules, because investment rules in the WTO are much looser and almost non-existent. There would be some problems with some services, but I think the United States could do that. You could, and this is something that I have been reluctant to support in the past, disinter, if you will, or reuse so-called Section 301, which is a section in U.S. trade law, which is a fairly broad definition that we would then decide on unfair trade with unfair trade practices. We could also look to antitrust laws. You could also have special rules about state-owned enterprises. Though a colleague of mine, it'd be interesting to see what the professor said about this. A colleague of mine at AEI has said that a lot of the recent investment from China has been driven on the private side, not by state-owned enterprises. So it's not that you would get right at them, but there are a set of, they operate differently, I think, than private commercial firms. So I have not in my mind come to what would be the best set of rules if we change them and when we change them. But I do think we do have to do something. Now, let me finally end up with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the so-called CFIUS process. The Congress looks as if it's moving to amend the rules under CFIUS this fall at some point. It has always been used, in my mind, thus far, responsibly. That law was passed to govern investment that might have direct national security implications and negative implications if a foreign firm or a foreign government was in control. As I say, I think it's been used very responsibly. And hopefully that will continue. There is some talk in the Congress, and I hope it is pushed back, to change our evaluation from a national security evaluation to a general public interest evaluation. I would very much oppose that because, again, I think the U.S. political system, that everyone would be coming up with an idea about why something was in the U.S. national economic interest. And it's an invitation to a kind of protectionism and industrial policy that I would oppose. I do think it is possible to expand some of the definitions in CFIUS to expand it to startups or other kinds of it's now just for mergers and acquisitions. I would want the Congress to look carefully before they actually expanded it to so-called greenfield, that is new investment from China or any other country. So that I think we will have some change in CFIUS, but I would still keep it, hopefully, directly related to national security. And that brings me to a conundrum in my own mind. I actually feel that I think the United States ought not to try to expand CFIUS laws so that they cover everything, because what you're doing is you're aiming at China and you're hitting other countries. So that I want to be very careful about changing, and I think I agree with the point that it's a win-win when the United States and we invest abroad and others invest here. So I want to be very careful about that, and hope that in the end that we can keep the Congress from doing something silly in order to get at get at China, but actually ending up getting at all other countries who invest in the United States. I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be with you. And I'm glad I'm following Claude, because I'm going to pick up on some of the same comments he made, and I think agree with some of them and then provide a slightly different perspective on some others. I think one of Yukon's slides was telling when he talked about the comparison with Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And I think it's fair to say that China's followed the same trajectory. The difference is that it's done it a lot faster and it's a lot bigger than the others. And both the speed and the size of the change that's occurred really over the last 20 or 30 years has been extraordinary and has had a disruptive impact on many aspects of the international trading system. The two in particular that I'm going to touch on is how the Chinese treat foreign enterprises in China and the impact of Chinese exports into other countries, particularly the United States. And I want to begin by reading what I think is probably the most telling summary of their policy, at least as far as their technology policy is concerned. And this comes from something that the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF, produced earlier this year. And it's short, but I quote, "As articulated in China's Made in Made in China 2025 strategy and his 13th five-year plan, China seeks leadership in over 400 advanced technologies, from semiconductors, high-performance computers, and cloud computing to aerospace and biotechnology. China pursues innovation mercantilist policies, such as the acquisition of foreign technology enterprises leveraged by non-market government-backed funds, forced transfer of technology or intellectual property, IP theft, abuse of antitrust, anti-monopoly policy, denial or restrictions of foreign firms' access to Chinese markets, development of China-only standards, massive subsidies for Chinese firms that compete, refusing to allow access to key resources unless companies located in China, or any number of other unfair trade practices. That's a fairly comprehensive indictment, and I won't detail it. Claude has actually gone into some detail on a couple of the elements of that. I think their ultimate goal, their ultimate policy goal, is clear, which is to extract the maximum amount of technology from Western entities, and I'm not just talking about the Americans, and then either force them out of China or limit them to a defined share of the market. One of the tricks, or one of the catches in this, is that defined share of the market is profitable. So American companies doing business in China make money. And I used to represent a lot of them, and they were all making money, but they were all unhappy because they were unhappy at, it was fundamentally a non-market situation. They were really there at the sufferance of the government, but they were profitable, so they had a dilemma. So how is the new president and the new administration going to deal with this? I guess the short answer is who knows, but first, let me give you a couple words of context about him. I think he really expresses, and his advisors express, a 19th century worldview about trade, which is basically that the rest of the world is behaving like mercantilists, and as a result, the United States is being taken to the cleaners. And instead of ranting about free trade, we should adopt the tactics of the others and play their game to our advantage. You can't find very many economists that agree with that, including me, but I think that's the prevailing view inside the administration. The second view is they, the foreigners, need us more than we need them. And this is based on his tendency to look strictly at bilateral trade balances, which I think Yukon has already explained is a mistake, but that is, is the prevailing administration view. And he makes the assumption that if we have a big deficit, that gives us leverage, because it means they need us more than we need them, and doing something to them will hurt them more than it will hurt us. We can talk about the reality of these assumptions later, but I think these are the operating assumptions. Third, he focuses almost exclusively on both on the bilateral deficit and on manufacturing, particularly cars and steel. He seems to have very little interest in services, is now paying lip service to agriculture because the farmers have been beating on him, but it's not one of his campaign platforms, and he returns again and again, as he is tonight when he goes to Youngstown, to manufacturing, and particularly steel, and also coal. Keep in mind also that his negotiating experience and his point of view has been in the context of real estate development, which tends to be a zero-sum process. I win, I get to build a building, and you don't. Trade diplomacy is, if it works, is positive sum. Find a way to produce win-win outcomes in which both sides think they've got something. And you're really good if you get the other guy to think that he got more than you did, especially if that's wrong. This is a big style difference. And the president's not at the table for all the negotiations, but he sets the tone. He sets the mood, and he sets the agenda. And I think this is going to be a rocky adjustment for him to understand how these kinds of negotiations work. So what does that mean for China? First, I think he's been cautious, a little bit to my surprise. That may be because he understands the complexity and importance of the relationship, which is what we spent the day talking about. It may be because he understands they're harder to push around than the Mexicans, although the Mexicans are not going to be any pushover, as I think we'll discover. He also has demonstrated with North Korea a willingness to link issues together. He's a transactional guy and is looking to make deals. You know, he didn't declare them a currency manipulator and then announced that he didn't do that because he's trying to get them to cooperate on North Korea. Instead, we agreed on a 100-day plan to address outstanding issues. There were initial results in May and more recent results last week. The May results were modest. They gave us beef for the third time. They gave us something on financial services for the second time. They promised to do something on biotechnology applications, which they've partly fulfilled. We gave them some chicken and some gas, and we went to their One Belt, One Road forum. Actually, in a way, this is reassuring. Conventional negotiation, conventional outcome, declaring victory when we got very little. Overselling trade outcomes is standard procedure. This is the way the system has worked for a long time, and it was kind of reassuring to see that maybe it'll work that way again in this administration, which is not a conventional administration. Then we had last week's CED results, which I found, at least, and my colleague may disagree with me, I found them less reassuring because I don't think there were any. And I was surprised at that because it's customary in a negotiation, particularly a high-profile one, to paper over disagreements with a small list of victories or at least commitments to do something in the future. And they didn't really do that this time. I give them points for honesty. It also makes me worry because I think there are people in the administration who would very much like to call this internally a failure and use that failure as justification for taking unilateral action down the line against China. The most immediate opportunity is steel in the 232 context. I'm not going to talk more about that, but we can if you want to. But there's also, the longer-term question of how we proceed on a whole raft of the issues I just talked about. If we do go down the unilateral road, I think we face a boatload of trouble. We may face it anyway, because if we actually at some point get around to focusing on what really matters in the relationship, which are the problems I described to you earlier from ITIF, go back to that statement, and instead of focusing on a series of individual transactions, the bilateral problems of the moment, I think we also get ourselves into a hole because the bigger issues that I've described really are very difficult to resolve, and they cannot be resolved without fundamental changes in the Chinese economy, which I think China will be reluctant to make for a whole variety of reasons we can also go into. There's also no question that unilateral action on our part would produce retaliation. The Chinese have already said so. They said so last fall. They specifically mentioned the obvious, Boeing, Apple, and agriculture. But the reality is there's a lot more they could do because we have a lot of supply chains that run through China one way or the other that would be susceptible to all kinds of Chinese disruption. And I don't want to give anybody any ideas, so I won't provide any further thoughts about that. So what do we do, and what should we expect to be done? Because it's not necessarily going to play out in the right way. It may very well play out in a problematic way. The two things I suggest that we should do is, first, we should have a strategy. If our approach is only to deal with whatever bilateral issues are on the table at the moment, we're going to win a few minor battles, beef, maybe Ipe, maybe not, but we're going to lose the war. So we need to think comprehensively about the problems, and by the way, talk to the people that experience the problems, which means the American business community primarily, and also experts inside and outside the government and the intelligence community who can speak knowledgeably about the state of the relationship. Second, something that this administration doesn't seem to do naturally, which is to accumulate multilateral pressure. Experience suggests that China is uncomfortable being the sole outlier. If you have a bilateral dispute with the United States, it's easy for them to dismiss that as part of the great American plot to encircle and destroy them. We're not that well organized, but it's easy to think about that if you're looking at it from China's point of view. If, however, you can construct a multilateral effort that includes the EU, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, all saying the same thing and all doing it at a high level, that's much harder for China to ignore. Prior administrations have made progress doing that on market access issues when they've been able to present a globally united front. A current example of that is the Global Forum on Steel Overcapacity that the G20 initiated. It's apparent that that agreement there is not going to be an easy task, but I think it has promise because it's a multilateral forum which allows China to argue that responsibility for the problem is spread widely amongst a number of countries, which is true, and it's easier for them to make concessions as part of a group rather than individually, which is what would happen. That process got a shot in the arm in Hamburg when deadlines were set, not entire deadlines, but some deadlines, which was a victory for the Trump administration. What's unclear is whether the administration is going to respect that result, let it play out, let the multilateral process do its work, or whether he's going to trample all over it by taking some preemptive unilateral action that will make it irrelevant. We'll see about that. What do we expect above and beyond that? I think you can expect to see more WTO dispute settlement complaints filed on both sides against each other. The Chinese have learned how to play this game very effectively, having been victims of it for a long time. They, with the help of a lot of American law firms, they have their own law, and they've complicated the scenario. I once asked one of my corporate members what he thought about anti-dumping countervailing duty laws, and he said, well, we're a petitioner in one case, we're a respondent in another, and we buy products that are subject to a duty order in a third. So you tell me what our position is. This whole issue has gotten a lot more complicated. The Chinese have become aggressive prosecutors as well as defenders, and this administration has made clear its intention to pursue more cases as well. So I think you're going to see an escalation there. I think you should also expect the U.S. eventually to beef up our laws against unfair practices. That's complicated and weedy. The most obvious problem is circumvention, where that is stuff goes from, it's subject to a higher tariff when it comes from country A. So country A doesn't ship it to the United States. Country A ships it to country B, where it's relabeled and becomes a product of country B and then shows up here. That's fraud, basically. But we don't have a very effective way of dealing with that. There are some things one could do. These, however, are micro remedies. They deal with individual products, individual sectors at a time. They don't deal with macroeconomics. The ITIF recommends a whole long list of other things to do. I won't go down the list for you. You can read it on their website. But there's a couple that I thought were interesting. One, that legislation that would allow firms to ask the Justice Department for an antitrust exemption so they could coordinate actions regarding technology transfer requirements from countries like China. They could do some things to expand one of our existing trade laws, Section 337, which deals with patent infringement, to counter theft of trade secrets, which is a case that the steel industry is currently pursuing. A third one, which I think probably goes too far but is interesting, is deny use of the U.S. banks and the banking system to companies that benefit from stolen IP. And there's a bunch of other ones that I think are worth talking about. Finally, to pick up on one of Claude's points, I think you can also expect a closer review of inward Chinese investment, which had been growing rapidly, although I think it's slowed down in the last, at least the first part of this year. I think it's very likely that Congress will again debate expanding the basis for denial, possibly by going beyond national security into something that Claude referred to, a net economic benefits test or something like that. That will probably come up. The first thing they will take up, I think, is applying the review to more situations. CFIUS review is limited basically to acquisitions. It excludes greenfield plants. It includes other kinds of technology acquisition arrangements. If you look at the total number of technology transfer agreements that this country enters into annually, CFIUS actually deals with a tiny fraction of them. The Defense Department has issued a report on this subject that's expressed some concern. This has caught the eye of people in China, people in the Congress, and I think you're going to see something about that shortly. That will raise the issue that Claude doesn't want to have raised, which is the issue of reciprocity, which has been gaining in popularity as a strategy for dealing with China. I'm inclined, I think, for the most part, to agree with Claude. He and I both lived through the first forays into that issue during the 1980s when it was Japan and not China, and reciprocity was the buzzword of the 1980s. I know the idea is an attractive one. At the same time, I think we need to remember that we have better global trade rules now than we did then, and it doesn't do us or the system much good if we violate them just because the Chinese have violated them. The United States is a rule of law country. And overall, the rules have been good to us. They should be. We designed most of them. Our adherence to them helps keep others in line with them, helps build rule of law. That's why I was disappointed in what the president did with TPP, because that would have helped build rule of law in Asia where it's needed, and ultimately would have helped build it in China, I think. If we abandon rule of law, we shouldn't be surprised if other nations do that as well, and it comes back to bite us. But the temptation is there, and I think you'll see a congressional debate about it this year. That will be led, I think, by Congress, not by the administration, and it will be bipartisan. But I think you can, in the near term, that's something that is most likely to happen. And with that, I'll stop, turn it over to my colleague.
I want to first thank Dr. Huang and Dr. Wu for inviting me. This is a challenge. I'm assigned to talk about something I have never talked about. That I'm not an expert, but I learned from 3 presentations already that this is not a black and white issue, although I do hear from Claude this is quite dark. A dark force is moving, and then from Paul. So what I'm trying to do is, as a layman, trying to contextualize the economic and trade relationship between U.S. and China. So first of all, 3 short stories. First is, Mayflower story. This is a hotel that reminded us of the beginning of the country that we call the United States. So I was in the room last night, I'm still suffering from jet lag, looking at the graffiti on the wall, and I saw the name of Richard Nixon. So I don't know whether Nixon stayed in that room or somehow he spent some nights over here. It just reminded me of in 1967, when he was about to run for president, he wrote the article, Zhu Feng wrote the article for Foreign Affairs that someone mentioned today. In that article, he said, we cannot leave China outside the international community, angry and vowing to bury the Western civilization led by the United States. I was one of those angry young men growing up in China. Now, fast forward to today. The Chinese are celebrating its astounding rise. Chinese are celebrating becoming the 2nd largest economy in the world and vowing to be on equal foundation with the United States. So at the same time, Americans are getting angry. And this anger is personified by Peter Navarro, whose documentary, Death by China, was narrated by Martin Sheen. And Trump is a big fan of that documentary. And I read last night that Peter Navarro has been stalking the West Wing, hoping to get into the Oval Office to brief Trump on how China is killing the United States. And of course, there are other people who are less angry than Peter Navarro, but they're equally upset. For example, James Mann, who is a resident writer at Johns Hopkins, not too far from here. He wrote that little book called The China Fantasy. He said, engagement policy should end. And he said the China model, the model of wealth without liberty, is a threat. Is a threat to national security of the United States. So that's the first story. The second story is a story about steel. I read last night also, in April, China produced more steel than all the steel-producing countries combined in the world. Now that reminded me of what happened in late 1950s and early 1960s, when Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, which in turn led to the unprecedented starvation in China. Now the goal of the Great Leap Forward is to catch up with the United States and Great Britain in output of steel, which caused disaster. But today, just in a short period of decades, China has overcapacity of steel production. China has to cut down its overcapacity, and because of this, China has to launch its BRI initiative to export steel if not to the United States, if not to the EU, but to some other countries. So that's the story of steel. You know what happened when China wanted, at the expense of 40, possibly 50 million people, to today that has become a big issue. And the last story is the global warming story. You know, for many years, China refused to join the global fight against global warming. Most Chinese, including the top leaders, basically said that's a Western conspiracy. That's an evil plan cooked up by the United States to undermine the rise of China. Now things have changed. Trump, in his tweets, basically said global warming is a Chinese conspiracy to undermine and to destroy the American economy. So these stories basically shed light on the decision made by Nixon, subsequently by President Carter, whom I'm working for today, unleashed forces that created what we see today, whether you call it dilemma or you call it a difficult situation. But if you look at it overall, both countries have benefited from the opening up. You know, China was outside the door. China got in the WTO. You know, I remember at the WTO time, so many in China claimed if China entered WTO, the Chinese national economy was going to be destroyed. It was not destroyed. It actually contributed to the the rise of China. So these three stories also told us that nothing is black and white. If you look at trade issues, I think Yukon's PowerPoint highlighted that what caused the trade balance or imbalance. Why there's such huge deficit. Trump and others, many Americans, because he was elected by angry Americans. He was elected by the steel workers. He was elected by the coal mine workers. These people wanted all these jobs to come back. They will never, ever come back. So I think by looking at these three stories, we see, we have to contextualize trade and economic relations. Now, so moving forward, as Paul said, what are we going to do? I think as someone, who's not an expert, I think from both sides, they need to look at this economic, commercial, or trade relationship in the context that trade generates prosperity. Prosperity leads to desire for more freedom, leads to prosperity. So if you look at this, yes, as many mentioned, the US deficit in terms of trade with China is at $347 billion. That's big. But if you look at the other side, I think there's recent reports indicating that US in 2015 has bought 165 billion of products from China. By 2030, US is going to export products to China valued at more than 500 billion. China is a country with a growing middle class, and that by 2030, China's middle class citizens will outnumber the total population of the United States. Chinese investment, we talk about investment over here, created directly or indirectly 2.6 million jobs over here. So, there are lots of positive sides. Both sides, I think, need to look at this. This is a positive force. There are negative sides. There are lots of issues that have been discussed over here. But, they need to believe that economic growth. I don't think James Mann is right in saying the China fantasy, that China will never liberalize, no matter how much wealth China is going to accumulate. Now, the second issue I want to say is less politicization of the trade issue, the better. You talk about CFIUS. If Congress is going to amend the law to make it more difficult for Chinese to invest over here, I think currently this year there are 9 reviews pending, largely in the technology and the financial sector. I saw one example saying Jack Ma's group wants to buy MoneyGram. I thought that was a good investment. But then there's the argument because American servicemen use MoneyGram. If Chinese controls this, we talk about data and all of that. So maybe this, I think they're filing their second review with CFIUS. And also, I think politicization is, domestic politics in both countries. Here, Trump has a mandate, as he said he was elected by people in Pittsburgh, not by people in Paris, when he pulled U.S. out of the Paris Accord. Now in China, President Xi is not elected, but he's also held accountable. We heard 19th Party Congress a lot today. And of course, the 19th Party Congress, on the one hand, he cannot afford to appear weak and making concessions to the United States. On the other hand, he will have to demonstrate to the people that he can manage this volatile relationship. More importantly, he wants to maintain stability in China, and cutting steel production will lead to firing of so many people in Hebei, which is a huge steel producing province in China. You have China, you have US, you have Germany, you probably have Hebei right there in terms of the output of steel production. And so I think we need to have a better understanding of the politics, but less politicization of trade and economic issues. And on the comprehensive economic dialogue, I think all agree, maybe with the exception of Ambassador Trey, who today said, it's very productive. We have the 100-day review, and moving forward, we have a one-year plan. But I thought, although Ambassador Trey today said everything happened according to the plan, I think the failure for President Trump to meet with Wang Yang is a big mistake. Wang Yang being the last survivor of the 4 previous party secretaries in Chongqing, and Wang Yang probably will become a member of the standing committee at the 19th Party Congress. Wang Yang being the party secretary in province, he's representing the liberal force. He's at a much higher rank than Yang Jiechi when during the diplomatic and security dialogue, Trump met him in the Oval Office. So I don't know the motive or the consideration in not meeting with him. I think by not meeting with him, regardless whether there will be particular outcome from the, because he already said, this is not negotiation, this is dialogue. Dialogue basically is designed for mutual understanding, not for concrete examples. President Trump should have met with him. By not meeting with him, now it's not just a face-saving thing. I think you probably have created an enemy, who will have a lot of say in the coming years in terms of U.S.-China relationship. And so lastly, I want to say is, Ambassador Cui today said, you have to look at the trade economic relationship, in a wholesome way. Yes, U.S. has a huge deficit. Yes, there's a lot of, the issue of fairness, the issue of balance, the issue of reciprocity that was discussed over here. I think if you look at, I think that's my assignment, is look at where China is going to go in the next 10 to 20 years. There was also mentioning of the 2 centennials China is going to celebrate, the so-called new normal of the Chinese economy. So China needs to change its economic growth model. China needs to increase its domestic consumption. China needs to create its own service industry, and China needs to have innovation. And because of all this need, the role U.S. can play is central, indispensable. And so I think American decision makers, including everyone in this room, and here on the podium should look at this relationship, and particularly economic and trade relationship, in a long-term way. China needs U.S., and U.S. also needs China. I do believe there is this interdependence. I don't believe that people say, if you look at economic integration of the past establishment power and rising power, it's not going to matter when decisions are going to be made to confront each other. I think they matter, and in the long term, this integration, this interdependence will bring the two countries much closer, will make and enable these two countries to be anchors for peace and prosperity in the world. Thank you very much.
I'm going to use moderator's privileges and ask the first set of questions, and I'm going to throw the floor open. Question to Bill and to Claude, and the question is, if the two sides are able to sign a high-quality bilateral investment treaty, will that be able to cover many of the areas of concern that you have talked about, or will issues of Made in China 2025 still be rearing their head? And let me ask the question to Yawei and to both of you, and that is, in the last term in office, President Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, they managed to create sufficient political capital to go for a very deep reform, and they brought China into the WTO. Do you see President Xi Jinping, even having accumulated power, consolidated power, being able to take China across the line in terms of a bilateral investment treaty with the US? So, go ahead.
Well, I am fairly skeptical of, would be in favor of a bilateral investment treaty if it actually covered a lot of these issues that we've talked about. But I don't think that it will. I don't think that the Chinese are ready to actually include such things in a bilateral investment treaty. So, number one, I don't think it's going to come to fruition. And I think if it did, you'd have an administration, I don't think it, for both good and bad reasons with this administration, they wouldn't accept a kind of watered down agreement, and I also don't think the Congress would accept it. I would be in favor of it if it were a real agreement, but I don't think that's possible. I don't know what Bill thinks.
I'm inclined to agree with Claude. I think I'm pessimistic about the BIT's future. It would only be a high-quality BIT if it included the things that we're talking about. If it does not include the things we've been talking about, one, the business community will not in its entirety support it. I think some will, but the greater number would not unless it were high quality. And I think the Congress would not pass it. But I also think Claude makes a good point. I don't think what it would ask, what a high-quality BIT would ask of China would be some extraordinary changes in the way their economy operates that I think they're not prepared to meet right now.
Yukon, do you want to go? No?
I'm fine.
Yep.
So for your question on, Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji accumulated enough capital so that it can push through reform, whether she has enough authority and power to carry out the reform. So on the first question, whether there is political capital or not, she is in an unprecedented position to push reform forward. However, what he sees as reform is an issue here. So, if you look at his Davos meeting speech and many others, where he and Premier Li Keqiang both say, if U.S. is out of globalization drive, we're willing to lead it. Of course, if you want to lead globalization, then you need to adhere to all the principles that have been talked about here: fairness, balance, intellectual property rights. You have to do all these things in the right way. Otherwise, your claim to leadership, or you want to maintain. I think Ambassador Cui today said, we're going to maintain, but at the same time reform global order. Then will become empty. So we'll have to see that, China's obviously special interest groups, SOEs, and also, I think just like Americans, they're also using national security to stop a lot of the reform measures. But I think if you look at the big picture, for China's economy to sustain its growth, whether it's a high single-digit growth or low growth, it has to grow. If it doesn't grow, then that's a huge problem for China. And for China's economy to grow, it has to integrate itself into the global economy. So on that front, I think I'm optimistic that China will be more receptive to American demands. It may not happen overnight, but gradually it is going to happen.
Let's open the floor to a quick set of questions. And if you could identify yourselves first.
Gordon Holden, the China Institute. There's been a lot of talk about steel, and my great worry about trade issues in general on a free market, when the governments tell me they're going to fix things and make things better, I get a bit skeptical. And right on steel, I know Yukon, you've been giving us some very good questions where we all got the wrong answers, and we have the impression perhaps that China's a massive exporter of steel to the United States. Well, guess which country is the #1 exporter of steel to the United States? Canada. China last year was 11th. Taiwan exported more steel to the US than did China, despite all this sense, the opposite. But where I do have some sympathy, where governments, including US government's efforts to rebalance things somewhat, is on this question of the levers that China can bring to bear. It's a rather opaque economic system. CFIUS has only security to use as a mechanism. The the central government, the provinces, even the municipalities have far more levers and means they can bring to bear, sometimes not visible, that can affect decisions, economic decisions. So my question, really, to come to a question after a statement is, this politicization where governments are going to be involved, sometimes responding to domestic opinion, seems to me risky. It isn't to say that there isn't a role for governments. Just a general comment and question there, perhaps people could answer.
Sure. Oh, please.
Well, just keep going.
Please, go on.
Yes, Bill Jones from EIR. I would like to direct my question to Yukon. I thought it was a very fascinating presentation that you gave. But I was most struck by the issue of the development of science from 1981. And of course, the issue of theft is involved in this, and there are classic stories about it. It reminds me of the United States during after the Revolutionary War. There was a process in England which Hamilton wanted to get into Paterson, New Jersey, and we were able to filter it from them. And but that did not create the development of the United States. It was the policy of the 4 papers of Alexander Hamilton on credit, on manufacturing, on national bank. They created the United States of America. In the case with China, in 1980, there was a determined commitment to the development of science and technology when Deng Xiaoping moved into that path. And they had their plans 863 and 972, where they designated certain areas where they, as low-wage manufacturing, would have a savings, but they would begin to direct it into certain fields where they intended to become the experts. And we see the results in the high-speed rail. They bought what they needed. Maybe they stole something, but essentially they developed new technologies as a result of their consistent effort towards science and technology. And that's a tremendous model. We used to use it. They're using it today. The reason we have problems between China and the United States is that we have forgotten how to do it. And we don't do it today. We haven't done it since the space program. Do we have a science driver in the United States today? I don't see it. So how do we develop those technologies? We've become, I guess, fat and lazy and thought we could, exist by simply selling our goods without having a policy that was corresponding to that. And I think that's where we have to get back to. But I think that was more so than theft or anything else, was this determined policy putting science and technology at the center of economic policy, which has led to the Chinese miracle that we see today more than anything else.
Thank you. I'm Wang Ling from a visiting fellow at East West Center in Washington. And my question is about the infrastructure. And we know that President Trump has devoted many efforts. He wants to devote many efforts to update the United States infrastructure. And we also know that China has one of the most competitive global infrastructure contractors in the world. I want to ask the panelists, especially American panelists, Mr. Barfield and Mr. Reinsch, from your point of view, based on your research and observation, do you think Chinese infrastructure contractors has opportunities in entering United States infrastructure market based on the commercial common ground, or do you think they don't have opportunity at all because of the perception of national security or the identity of most of the Chinese contractors are SOEs? Thank you.
Okay, one last one right here. Oh.
Huisheng Shou from Tsinghua University. And I have two questions to Dr. Huang. The first is, you probably already discussed this in your book, but I haven't read it. So the question is that, are you concerned about the possibility that North Korea crisis could damage the commercial network in East Asia? I mean, in other words, do you think the network is resilient enough to stand the political shock? And the second question is that, I'm sure you discussed in your book, what's your view about the future relationship between China and the US, particularly given the domestic anxiety in this society, in the United States? Thank you.
Would you like to take one last question when you ask?
My name is Li Yang. Thanks for all your presentation. It's wonderful. But I want to start from the beginning. First, how do you verify your data? You know, the data is whether you just get from somewhere and somebody just send it to you, or whether it is from government record. But there's no verification. A lot of time, government data or their resources is simply diverted to benefit a few, not for general public. And then second is for especially the one who say rule of law is good for production, but the problem is in the United States, the rule of law is missing, and there's no good justice, and a lot of things is the employment or job is really this service is negative productivity. So unless we have two different kind of measure, one is for productivity, one is for negative productivity, unless we separate this out, you don't really measure the productivity right. And some IT or health professionals, or even any productivity, you just think about it, it's negative productivity. So if we mix all this together, it's not going to help our understanding of real problem. So I just wonder if we can really, based on this concept, and like all the trade negotiation should be based on the general public or the labor or working class rather than benefit the lawyers or the wealthy people or multinational corporation or their investment state provision. We got to do our effort right.
Okay,
thank you.
You've got questions on steel and its politics, science and technology, U.S. prescriptions, infrastructure, etc. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I started last time. Bill, it was probably Bill and me. Why
I
don't
can
he
do
start,
two of
and then
them.
I'll come. I'll pivot.
I can do infrastructure and say a word about steel. That'll help. On your infrastructure question, I don't think there's a chance in the world that Chinese contractors are going to be given an opportunity to participate in what you're talking about. First of all, it may never happen, which is a question of U.S. domestic politics. But this is the Buy America administration. This is the administration that's determined to do everything, try to create jobs here, for better or for worse. But equally important, you know, the Chinese, despite commitments in their accession, have never signed the government procurement agreement. We have no obligation to them, and they have no obligation to us when it comes to procurement of what you're talking about. So I think that the idea that there's going to be a large Chinese presence on infrastructure construction in the United States is something that's very unlikely to happen. On steel, I could go on at great length. Full disclosure, the law firm that I'm senior advisor to represents steel clients, and I used to spend a lot of time on it when I worked on Capitol Hill. You're right in the sense that direct imports from China have been going down, and they've been going down as a result of the unfair trade practice cases that have been successfully filed against them. But that steel hasn't disappeared. It goes elsewhere, and it ends up here. I mean, the classic example that's been the focus of some debate is the Chinese sell, I don't know, billet or plate or something to the Koreans. The Koreans roll it into coil and then make OCTG out of it, and that ends up here. And it benefits from the dumping, except it's legitimately a Korean product because it's been substantially transformed in Korea, but it benefits from the low cost of China. So I don't think there's any question amongst anybody that's looked at this problem that the major culprit, for the reason that Yukon said, in the global overcapacity problem is China. And that problem is not going to be solved unless China undertakes a significant capacity reduction program, which they are reluctant to do because it will involve the layoff of hundreds of thousands of workers, which will cause them a big political problem. So, I mean, this is not an easy path. However, I think if you talk to Chinese economists, they will tell you the same thing, that that is exactly what they ought to do in terms of making their economy healthy.
I agree fully on the infrastructure. There's one thing that I skipped over in my notes because of the glare here, and that is in terms of the things that we could do that would not go outside of current rules. I have argued for some time that it is far beyond the time that the United States should take China to the WTO for the Great Firewall. Clearly, the censorship regime has been used as an instrument of industrial policy. Without getting into details, we're late now. There is some evidence that the WTO would be amenable to a suit. There was a suit that's not exactly like this that we lost, the United States lost, in which basically the WTO said, look, you can invoke national security or public order or public morals. That is an exception in the WTO. But you can't use that to sweep out whole sectors. The point being that you might find an article in the New York Times that you think you should expunge, but you can't just wipe the New York Times off the market from doing that and take that as an analogy. So I think that's a very good thing that the administration should do. We've been reluctant to do it because we're really not sure that we would win, but it's worth testing as far as I'm concerned.
Let me make some general observations on these kinds of very broad issues. You're right about science and technology being very important in China, and they cannot be innovated without the fact that they invested so much in that area. So I agree fully with you. Theft is not successful in a country unless your science and technology capabilities are strong. So if you are a country with very weak science and technology, and someone gives you the blueprints of a great technology, you're not going to make any money from it. So they actually go very, very closely together. That's why there are very few countries that actually can steal technology and make money from it, because their science and technology is not good enough. So one of the things they point out, in fact, a strategy of theft requires actually strong technical skills, and very few countries have that. There's a general question about US-China. Are they compatible in the long run or not? And there's certainly a lot of discussions. Now, I'm an economist, so I look at it slightly differently. The question is whether the structure of these two economies are compatible, or will they move in different directions? Because in one of my slides, I basically pointed out that China has been very successful in generating productivity increases in manufacturing of a scale that we have never seen before. So what that's done is led to a global fall in manufacturing prices and the quality, which has benefited to the West, because now they have a pile of resources. The problem is that the West didn't take that pile of extra resources and channel it into investment and productivity increases in the United States. So the United States invests about 15, 16% of GDP. It hasn't changed. China invests 45%, 3 times as much. So the critical question in the US, is there some way that I can channel what China is doing so that it actually leads to an increase in investment and productivity in the United States? And the answer is yes, there is. It hasn't been done yet. The answer is China has this pile of savings. Remember, I showed you that diagram where China has enormous savings surpluses. Now, what happens to that savings surpluses? It actually goes into real estate. It goes in portfolio things which don't actually generate directly any benefits for America. So it goes to the stock market, savings, U.S. Treasury bonds, boom, boom, boom. The critical point then is, can you take that excess savings and reach a formal agreement with the Chinese to say that I would like to use this for increasing my investment in infrastructure in the United States in the following ways? Because the U.S. infrastructure problem is essentially they don't have a pile of extra savings to actually fund it, nor can they generate the tax revenues to fund it. So it's a non-entity. Here's China with a ton of excess savings going in all sorts of different directions. So how do you transfer that so that you can reach a grand deal with the U.S. and say, let us jack up your infrastructure? That's the role that China can provide, and it's potentially possible. Now, the other point I'd like to make is people like to write that, in fact, U.S. and China are quite different. In my book, I actually say, here are 10 major issues that countries face. And the irony is that U.S. China, they have exactly the same problems. But they don't realize they have the same problems. Let me just give you an example. Both countries have exactly the same degree of inequality, and that's political vulnerability. The Gini coefficient is 0.47. Same for U.S., same for China, but they're different. In China, the inequality is inequality across regions in urban rural areas. In the U.S., the inequality is in the urban areas, and so with the middle class shrinking vis-a-vis the relatively others. And the question is, how do you deal with these two inequalities? They're actually driven by quite different factors, but people don't realize actually that these factors are linked. And so I basically discuss how that can be actually affected. People talk about the rule of law here. The rule of law is actually a problem for both countries. In China, the problem is the rule of law in terms of how you govern the state. And that's a problem. In the U.S., the problem with the rule of law is we have no good rule of law that governs the functioning of the market. And both countries, therefore, have a rule of law problem. We have a problem of size in this country. Our banks and everything are too big to fail. China's a problem with size. Its corporations are too big to manage. They have a fiscal problem in the United States. We have huge budget deficits it can't cope with. The great irony is that China has a huge fiscal problem. Its budget is actually too small. So the great irony is in each of these key areas where both sides are actually paralyzed, they actually both have a same kind of a problem, but of a different nature. And they could actually, if they work with each other, find that they could actually find a synergism. But if we begin with the view that the two sides are different, and then we go down a wrong track, in my view, in terms of the solutions. So my book is basically saying, this is the China conundrum. We actually don't understand the nature of the problem. And when you don't understand the nature of the problem, you always go down the wrong path. That's what I think is the fundamental issue here, from an economist perspective.
Yawei, do you want to have the last word, maybe on that question of linkage between North Korea and trade, or anything? No, you.
I think it was in my prepared remarks is a linkage issue. I don't think U.S. should link what China is going to do to North Korea with trade and economic dialogue, because that's a separate issue. What if China says, we're going to link everything U.S. is demanding to the Taiwan issue? Because that is not going to be productive. But I also believe what Zhu Feng wrote in the Journal of Foreign Affairs, that this is the common ground. Yukon talked about a lot of common ground that a synergy could be created. I think denuclearization, peace in the Korean Peninsula is the issue that can get U.S. and China to improve its relationship. This is what is binding, so Washington and Beijing can work together, can build up the trust that is so rare in this relationship.
Thank you very much.
About translating the book into...
Yeah, the Chinese version is coming out, but it's right now being translated.
It's already being translated?
It's being translated.
Okay. Yeah, I was asking, if not, we'll find a publisher for you, because it's such a good book.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't intend to summarize today's conference. My watch tells me that we should let you go home, but please do allow me a few minutes to share with you my observation on this conference. So the 4 panels that we discussed today are built out from the strategic relations and to the regional issues, Asia Pacific, and to the South China Sea, and finally in the economic and trade relations. Honestly, we do see a lot of difference between the 2 countries, which actually build on, I think, a lot of misperception. But we also have to equally admit that we actually have a lot of common interests and convergent views on many issues that we talk about today. So I think we all, both countries and the people from both countries deserve a better and a fair and a more objective observation or views on each other. So I think that's exactly the goal of the Institute for China-American Studies, which hopefully we can provide a very good venue and platform to bring together the scholars from both countries to talk about the issue that we all concern in terms of China-US relations. So I would like to thank, first of all, our panelists who joined us today, and especially to those travel from overseas who still suffer from the jet lag. And I'd also like to thank our co-organizers and the 3 institutions and their leadership who are present here today, including Dr. Wu Shichuan and Professor Gordon Holden, and also Professor Zhu Feng. And I'd also like to thank our colleagues in ICAS, and also our students, interns, who volunteered to help us today's conference. So with that, we'd like to announce the conference adjourned, and we hope to see you next year in our annual conference. Thank you.